Tonight, we're going to be speaking about Adena/Hopewell art. Art is a very loaded term when we're talking about prehistoric cultures, because very rarely did prehistoric cultures do something when it did not have another meaning. Another thing is that most of the materials that we're going to see tonight are what we call material culture. It is the byproduct of day-to-day life and how people were and what they believed in and what they held most dear. And so I want you guys to think about, what do you hold most dear? And do you have anything at your house that represents that? Whether it's political, whether it's religious, whether it's family-based, whether it's community-based, whether it's a part of your heritage, whether it is something that is just something to help you remember. These are the things that people have been making for time immemorial. And the Adena Hopewell people were not separated from that. So the first thing I'm going to say is art is a subjective modern term that I really hate. But for this purpose, when we talk about Hopewell people and Adena people, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Mounds. Thank you. And in fact, in archaeological terms, the definition of the Adena and into the Hopewell cultures is the fact that they are mound building cultures. I'm only going to show 2 pictures of mounds tonight. That's it, the end, no more. I can talk to you a lot about them because, you know, I kind of like them. But we're going to talk more about what were people thinking, how were people relating to their world, and a little bit more about some of the beauty that came out. But beauty is a byproduct. So I'm going to say it one more time. Beauty is a byproduct. All right, so we're going to begin off tonight with, who were the Adena? The Adena were not a tribe. If there's anything I can stress more than that, they were not a tribe. In fact, they were something that we call a cultural impression, which basically means that people were doing things pretty similar enough for us to go, yeah, they look like they talk to one another, and they look like they talk to one another. The time range that we normally give to them is about 500 BCE, which means before current era, to about 100 current era. That's a little subjective, and it's also based on your location. Here in Indiana, the Adena were phasing out about 0. They were localized, pretty localized, considering a lot of our other cultural impressions of the time. In Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, parts of New York, parts of Maryland, and parts of Pennsylvania. Believe it or not, Adena is a Hebrew word that means beautiful or graceful. And it came from General Worthington's estate. He was one of the very first legislators in Ohio. And there was, on his estate, an Adena burial mound. And as the first scientists that began looking at the stuff that was coming out of those mounds said, hey, this looks like these people had it together. And looks like some other sites that we've seen. And so they used the Adena estate as the type site for the Adena people. And so it's in Chillicothe, Ohio. If you ever get a chance to go see it, it is a beautiful estate. That's it up there on the top. When people start talking about the Adena, there's a lot of, I hate to say debate, as to who they were. Were they front runners of the Hopewell group that came in after them? Did one run out the other? Were they part of the same group and they just evolved from one group to another? Some people even say that the Hopewell is the final expression of the Adena, and then the Hopewell archaeologists say, nah, the Adena was the beginning seeds of the Hopewell culture. And so for the very longest time, when we were looking at archaeological sites, it appeared that the Adena were distinct, break in time, and then the Hopewell. And what that really spurred on that, there was one group of people and another group of people either came in after they were gone or ran them out. But here's the fun thing about where you guys live. You have one of the very first transitional sites that was known about. And that is one of the reasons why now today, modern Hopewell archaeologists, we believe that the Adena evolved into the Hopewell. What do we know about the Adena? They had burial mounds. Their burial mounds tended to be, they could be pretty small. The one on our site is only 3 feet by 3 feet. Most of the time they were a single burial that had rocks placed over them and then dirt. And you will see these littered across the landscape. Oftentimes they were up on high locations, so they had a really great view. And they had started working geometric earthworks. So the big ones like the Great Mound at my park, the round circular types with the embankments, but they were for ceremonial purposes. They were not burying people in those mounds. They were burying them in the conical small mounds. Now when I say conical and small, that's a general rule of thumb. Grave Creek Mound, which is in West Virginia, is an Adena site. It's over 75 feet tall. And at Miamisburg, Ohio Mound, which is just across the border in Ohio, is also about 65 feet tall. There were multiple burials, small mound with small mound with small mound, and they just built up. Also, one of the things that we have to, archaeologists, how do we even know what culture is? How do we know what these people were doing? Did they leave us journals? Nope. Did they leave us electronics? Did they leave us photographs? Did they leave us, what did they leave us? Pottery, arrowheads, and basically things that are going to persist through time. So really, as archaeologists say, this is the Adena Hopewell horizon, we're saying, wow, there was a whole bunch of arrowheads and ceramics that kind of looked alike. So the Adena ceramics were fairly basic, and they didn't vary much. And this is one of the reasons why, as we look at all these sites and we see these things being made the same way over and over and over again, and decorated pretty much the same way over and over and over again, we're seeing that this is probably a bunch of people that talk to one another, and somewhere in their cosmology or somewhere in their storytelling, they said, this is the way it's done. No pretty swirls, no giraffes, no big fancy things. It wasn't an artistic expression. So remember what I said, beauty is a byproduct. They were very much using these materials as functional materials to help cook, help store seeds in. Also, they were using this as a form of saying, this is my community. These are my people. And that's really how they used their ceramic. The Adena, quote unquote, art style was, I won't say that it was basic, because it wasn't. In fact, the Adena had this very beautiful, flourishing art style that was starting to evolve. But when we look at this very tubular pipe here, that is what an Adena pipe looks like. We do know that they were using those to smoke with. I don't know where they put the tobacco. But we found these type of tubes with materials that included pigment, so they could potentially have been used for painting. Sometimes other archaeologists have thought that maybe they were used for a type of medical practice, which was something was hurting, so they would put it up against the skin and they would suck out the illness. The Adena pipes were pretty straightforward. However, as time started moving along, they started tinkering around with other idea forms. I want to put this in reference. These people lived very close to the land. They were very in touch with their plants and animals that were around them. And their religion form, or their belief form, sprung out of that. And so a lot of times what we see, and I'm going to use a big word now, zoomorphic, which basically means animal-shaped. Animal-shaped materials started coming out. So if you look below, this big guy down here, he is also a pipe that is modeled out of that same Adena straight pipe form, but at the end, they have included an animal head shape, whether that's a wolf, but it's probably a wolf, look by the looks of it. And for your reference, all Adena and then Hopewell pipes were smoked from the mouth of the zoomorphic form. So like, and interestingly enough, when we talk about religion and such, even modern day Native American groups that have their traditional language still with them, when we talk about that spark, that life force, that part of the creator, it always comes back to some form of breath. The breath of the creator, the breath of life. And so when we look at these pipes, we're looking at them exchanging that vital spark between a spirit form, guide, elements of that animal that they wanted to include in themselves, but they did that through the smoking of the pipe. And next question is, was there tobacco? The answer is yes, there was. Tobacco was a Central American plant, and it had worked its way up here into North America, but has anybody here ever grown tobacco? It's hard, isn't it?
My dad right outside of my house.
It's persnickety, and you got lots of bugs that love to eat it. And so what we think is that the early shamans or the early holy people had planting knowledge to keep tobacco alive, whereas the rest of the population may not have been as green-thumbed as that other person. So tobacco was definitely used. Other substances were used as well. And for the most part, what they were trying to achieve out of smoking was some sort of psychological state. So tobacco and its natural chemicals creates a sense of euphoria, as does some of the other materials that they may have smoked. So that's what they were thinking that might have been happening, is they were trying to obtain a calm or altered state as they were smoking. Now, mind you, this is me looking at stuff that may have been, I might have 20 to 30 examples, and I'm telling you all about this culture that existed for 600 years. Something else I like to show is this diagram over here that shows kind of how Adena burial mounds were put together and what happens when they started to involve more than one burial. So they would locate a burial. Did I mention that these people were completely nomadic? Completely. They may have been moving around 8 times a year. They were not farming. There was no impetus for them to stay in one location. So they were getting up and they were moving around the landscape quite a bit, but they were returning to certain special places that they would then inter their dead. They would have ceremonies, they would meet and greet, because I promise you these people were living in very small groups, 30, 50 people maybe maximum, like the maximum. And if you wanted to get married, you might not want to get married to anybody in your immediate group, which would include your next blood kin. So oftentimes they would come together and, shop around for a mate. The burial mounds were something that were used and then left for a time. And people returned, buried another person, and left for a time. And when I'm talking a person, am I talking the entire community? Am I talking the entire culture? No. Most people were being cremated. The people who were buried were very special individuals. Either that or very unlucky individuals. But they tended to be very special individuals. These are people that we believe had some form of, not political clout. If you're living in a group of 30 to 50 people and your grandfather is the one that's overseeing your group, you do what granddad says. That was about the most sophisticated of their political system that they got. And so when they came together, those grandfathers would then all go together and have to have a meeting of minds. But these people that were being interred were people of potential spiritual connections, people of veneration for a family. These are very special individuals. And I'm going to tell you, everything that I'm showing you today is a grave good. When you move around a landscape, you leave, every now and again, you'll leave points hither, thither, and yon whenever you've gone hunting or when you're making things. But your special sacred items, you're not just going to pitch out on the roadside. These are things that are going to stay with you. And in fact, a lot of the pipes that we're going to see today had not only been damaged, but destroyed several times. And then it shows evidence where the people put them back together. So we're going to jump forward in time. Who are the Hopewell? The Hopewell people, or event horizon, or artifactual horizon, or culture type. Remember, it's not one tribe. And in fact, the Hopewell culture expanded all over the eastern half of the United States. They were type sited at a farm in Chillicothe, Ohio. Does this sound familiar? It's about 6 miles away from the Adena estate. And it was owned by Mordecai Hopewell. And believe it or not, his farm site is something you can go visit today, but most of the mounds, because of consistent farming, have been truly worn down. But you can still go there, and the National Park Service does oversee the site, so there is some interpretation. We call this an artifact horizon for a particular reason, but we're doing it because of construction, we're doing it because what it's made out of, we're doing it because of certain styles. But artifact is really the word. The Adena people left us some artifacts, but not to the level that the Hopewell people did. Something happened, something big, something that allowed people that were making it day to day and exchanging ideas and living a pretty good life, but all of a sudden they developed an artist class. All of a sudden they developed an ability to have these extensive trade networks. So the Hopewell, they began flourishing about 100 before current era. Remember the Adena? There was overlap. So I like to use this when I talk to my fourth graders. Everyone knows the fashion, phenomenon that happened where all the young folks are wearing their pants down here. I bet you here in Anderson, it took a little bit longer to catch on than it did in LA. And so we think that this is what was going on. There was a cultural influence that was sweeping through, but it was taking some areas a little bit longer to catch up and say, man, wearing my trousers around my ankles sounds fun. Let's do it. And we call this period of time artifactually observed, and that's because, once again, of the stuff they started leaving us, and we'll talk about the stuff here in a minute. It was observed all over the eastern half of the United States. Here's a problem. We call Hopewell is a type, but there were individual expressions of how that type was manifested. Okay, that's big words, Kelly. What are you talking about? With certain cultures, we think that ideas started happening locally, and then people started getting together, and over time, it became a melting pot. And those ideas then swirled around and redistributed out. And we really think that's how the Hopewell culture got going. All of these smaller groupings, which the Adena would have been one of them. There was about 8 or 9 different cultural types that they think all fed into what they think eventually ended up being the Hopewell interaction sphere, or the Hopewell. And the ones that we worry about most here in Indiana would be the Ohio Hopewell. That's all those cool mounds over in Ohio, and the one that we have right here in Anderson. And actually there's one more. We used to say that we were the western frontier of the Ohio Hopewell grouping. And guess what? We're not. There's a site in southwestern Indiana called the Man site that now takes that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that site because it's really very exciting. So the local expressions of the larger Hopewell culture would be things like religion, how they lived, what did they do for ruling? Because obviously if you've got lots bigger groups, I'm sorry folks, we're humans. If you get a whole bunch of us together, someone's got to be in charge. Because if not, we all run around like chickens. And so that's what happens. It's a hunting and gathering society. These people were hunting and gathering, but they were starting with cultivation of plants. What kind of plants? Squash, sunflower, marsh elder, which is a seedy weed to us today, knotweed, some of the big crops. Corn did not arrive here until the Hopewell civilization was on its way out. And in fact, they think that that's one of the reasons why the Hopewell civilization went out. And then they're best known for their monumental geometric earthworks. And most of them, yes, most of them are aligned with celestial forces, whether that's the sun, the moon, the stars. The sky was their roadmap. It was a big, big force for them. The other thing that the Hopewell are very well known for is their extensive trade networks. And when I say extensive trade networks, I'm talking, for us, 1,650 miles one way. They were getting obsidian from Wyoming. They were getting grizzly bear claws and this particular type of flint, which is coming out of the Dakotas. They were getting conch shell from the Gulf of Mexico. They were getting shark's teeth from the Atlantic Ocean. They were getting silver from Canada. They were getting mica from what's now North Carolina. These people were moving and trading. And when I say moving, yes, I do mean that we believe that we think that they were actually physically going to all of these places. And these are what they look like. So mica, what is mica? Anybody know what mica is? It's silvery stuff. For those of you that are old enough, you might remember that your oven windows were coated in mica before glass became a thing. And it fractures, it's a mineral, and it fractures on a very predictable plane. And it's highly, highly reflective. But I want you to see the sheet mica that you see here, that is over 3 feet in diameter. And there's a belief that people weren't going and quarrying this and then making their stuff and then taking it back with them. They think that there was a manufacturing style, that there were people at the site that were creating the base materials, and that then they were being shipped to certain locations to be worked. For example, North Carolina to the Scioto River Valley in Ohio. That's a long way for that sheet of mica to go without it breaking. They found over 400 of those at the Hopewell National Site in Chillicothe. Other materials over here, I know it's kind of hard to see, but one of those is a silver ear spool. That is something that is age old. And so ear spools were definitely a part of their wardrobe. There's silver and copper. Obsidian. Obsidian is a volcanic glass. As I said, the nearest quarry that you can get obsidian in any size is in Wyoming. Copper was probably one of the most traded materials, especially in this area. In this area, mica, copper, and obsidian were the 3 top trade items. But to give you an example of how much copper we think was floating around in the Hopewell timeframe, we think over 100 million tons of copper was being quarried, worked, and moved during the Hopewell timeframe. And when we start trying to think about putting people together, it's very hard for us to kind of guess, hundreds of tons of earth, hundreds of tons of copper being moved around. You got to think that there was a whole bunch of people here, but we just don't know. Common images of the Hopewell. We all talked about this. Mounds, right? And Serpent Mound has been redated. Originally, it was an Adena site, and then it got dated, and they said, oh, no, it's much later. It's like 1000 AD. And then they only tested in one spot, though, when they said it was 1000 AD. And when they went back and retested the whole puppy, they did core samples all the way through the body of the serpent. It dates back to late Adena, early Hopewell. Serpent Mound is located in Peebles, Ohio. It is in sort of western, kind of central western Ohio. It's about 45 minutes south of Chillicothe. Anybody want a road trip? Chillicothe, you can see literally about 15 different mound groups in about an hour. These are some of the other common images of the Hopewell tradition. I use them a lot on my camp t-shirts. We've got the what's known as the copper hawk. They believe that this was a peregrine falcon. Some alternative theorists believe that that was a parrot. The hand in the middle is about yay big, mica. And then the hawk claw, which is on the very end, that is also made out of mica. These are some of our very popular images. But now we're going to start talking about some of the other material culture. Now, if you are an enthusiast of archaeology, you may have seen some of these, but sometimes, no, not sometimes, a lot. I went out on hundreds of websites, and they literally have materials that were 1,500 years later mixed in with stuff that was earlier. And so be discerning when you do research on archaeology. We look over here. This is the Adena time frame. The Adena, one of the heights of the Adena culture that we see right before they kind of roll over into that Hopewell theory is this pipe. And they believe that this pipe is a person of small stature. And they believed that those people of small stature were actually heavy medicine people. The type of dwarfism that only occurs in 1 out of every 15 to 20,000 people. And so the likelihood of there being very many of these folks being born during that time frame to a fairly limited population is very low. This pipe was found about 18 miles away from a mounded grave that contained a person of small stature. And why in the world would they think people of small stature were important? I'm sure anybody who's come to my park has probably heard the word puckwudgie at least once. Puckwudgies were the small people that lived in the woods. Sometimes they were mischievous, sometimes they were helpful. But people that were different were powerful. And when I mean powerful, it means, think about what we do. Something's very different, we have a tendency not to like it or venerate it. And it's interesting because they feel that perhaps this burial that was located was an ancestor that further people down the line considered to be a heavy spiritual relation for them. And so that's why they created a pipe of him. So moving along, we've got the Wilmington tablet, which is in the Ohio Historical Society. That is also an Adena feature. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of controversy over what we think these things did, but what we do know is that they were covered in pigment. We're not sure if they were stamps that they put on a body and then tattooed. On the back, we find areas where needles were being sharpened. Could be stamping of fiber. Now, moving forward, we're moving out of the Adena into the Hopewell. Once again, we go from fairly localized resources into more exotic resources, so copper and mica. And then roughly around 400 AD, current era, something starts happening. The Hopewell groupings start falling apart. Their communications get blocked. We start seeing that people in the local regional areas were developing off into different directions. And we think it has a lot to do with the fact that people were starting to farm and becoming more homebodies because they were watching their gardens. But this also related to additional increased warfare and political strife because groups were starting to get bigger. And interestingly enough, between roughly 400 and 800 AD, there is this decline, pause, before another massive grouping launches off, and they were almost unified all over the eastern half of the United States, even all the way over to the Rockies. And so at the very end here, they think that this was a charnel house post. Charnel house was an area that they would bring people to cremate. Charnel house post with an eagle on top of it was roughly about 600 AD. And that is in Florida. Florida was one of the epicenters of the group that flourished as the Hopewell were going away. And they picked up and launched off. Florida did, of their own volition.
Is that wooden or stone?
That is wooden. So let me give you some real fast things. In archaeology, stone and ceramic preserves. Wood is an absolute find. Fiber is a miracle. So when we start looking at alternate sources, that's why we're going to show you a whole bunch of rocks today. And maybe a few pots. We get back to that question, art? Probably not. It was probably an expression of their understanding of the world. But first, what do we know about the Hopewell? Well, we know how they dressed, or we think we do. We know what kind of hairstyles they liked, because they did leave us some figurines that showed us kind of what we think. Now, mind you, this might have been ceremonial attire, but we're not 100% sure. The three ladies in the middle, so you can see that they don't have anything up top, but down below they have a skirt. And sometimes when you get really close to those skirts, you can actually see where they have incised or kind of scraped away areas that show patterns on them. Their hairstyles are pretty awesome. And these actually persisted into the historic period in certain cultures. The gentleman over here closest to me is made out of mica. And then the gentleman on the other end, we can see that the gentlemen were somewhat closely clad as to the ladies. Nothing up top, but some sort of material down below. So sometimes what archaeologists do is we are looking at materials that come to us from prior places and locations to tell us a little bit more about what do these people look like. How did they live? Were women just as important as men? I mean, these are questions that we have about our society. But we try to project it because guess what? We're humans. We like to ask the same questions over and over and over again. And so with what we're going to call our more average population, that's what we think a lot of these figurines show, even though they may have been a venerated ancestor. They may have been an idealized, like I hate to say like the GQ, I want to be like this. A lot of the figurines that come to us are more religious based. And so some of the things we're going to talk about here over the next few minutes are a little bit more about what we think their religion was like. But before I go there, there's been a recent paper put out as recently, I actually saw the lecture maybe a year and a half ago, but they just recently put out the scientific paper where the Ohio Historical Society is talking with modern day Shawnee tribal members. And it is oftentimes believed by archaeologists that the Shawnee are probably the closest, probably ancestral relation to the people that lived in the Ohio Hopewell civilization grouping. And they had these spheres that were taken out of the Seep Pricer Mound. And they're round balls that have gravings on them. I forgot to put that slide in, I'm sorry. But they're really cool. And they're all about a little bit bigger, or smaller than a pool ball. And for the longest time, they were something that people didn't know what to do with. Archaeologists, they've made a lot of thought patterns and a lot of guesses and a lot of educated this, that, and the others. But when they finally stopped and asked some of the modern Native American tribal members, they said, that looks like the thing that we use on our water drum. They take a piece of leather and they drape it over a piece of ceramic. And they take these balls and they wrap the leather around the ball and tighten it so it creates a drum called water drums. Huh. And to the best of their thought pattern, that's what that is. And since that discovery, or that thought pattern, the archaeologists, along with the folks from the Shawnee tribe, have looked at a lot of the ceramics, and they have found a lot of the ceramic types that come out of that location also were very much candidates to be water drums. One of the other things that I also need to mention as we move forward, I already told you a little bit about it, everything you're going to see is a grave good. And to Native Americans, and actually even to the federal government, as of 1990, they passed a law called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And what does that mean? That means if we have archaeological materials that we definitely know are grave goods or ceremonial items, in theory they should be repatriated to the group that most closely relates to the people that they came from. The problem with that is sometimes when you're looking 1,000 years in the past, ancestry gets a little convoluted. Anybody here do genealogy? Can you tell me where your ancestors were 1,000 years ago? Yeah. So it gets a little convoluted. So most of the things that we're looking at today, most Native Americans would prefer that they would not show. So with that, I'm going to say very respectfully that I understand, but I also think that there's a lot of value in understanding the people of our past, even though they're not our direct ancestors, they are the ancestors of our land. I also put in quotations, shaman. Shaman was a group of people that were in Russia. That is what, then they were the religious leaders of this group in the steppes of Russia. And so many people don't even like us to use the word shaman when we talk about Native American holy people, religious people. And then again, we don't even know if they were truly straight religious people. Sometimes they were, once again, venerated ancestors. Sometimes they were people that were the ones that spoke sense, which at some point we would have called politicians, but I don't think we'd do that anymore. One of the things that we see with this type of class of people is that they were very closely related with some sort of animal being. And so we find, and over and over again, copper headdresses that have deer antlers. They weren't solid copper. Oftentimes they had another material underlying them, and then they were, the copper was something called cold hammered. So they take copper ore and they would beat it into thin sheets, and then they would roll those. Now, they were tinkering with the whole smelting thing. They were heating and cooling these sheets, not really fully melting, but they were kind of almost there. But we see these copper headdresses over and over and over again, and sometimes in different stages of development for deer. Sometimes they're just nubs. Sometimes they are full racks with multiple tines on them. And there is a belief, and looking cross-culturally, we see all these people that do relate to deer. And so we believe that these folks probably had some understanding that deer were a source of power. So Kelly, why in the world do you have this snake on the end of this deer shaman slide? So when I say that we're interpreting things, that's exactly what we're doing. That means sometimes our interpretation might be wrong. So is it a snake? Is it a deer? Is it a cougar? Oh my! So when the artifact was initially found, it was found in two pieces. The tongue, the forked tongue, was a piece, and the ovulate material there was another piece. And it was just assumed that they belonged together. Some people, archaeologists, say actually the forked tongue was never supposed to go with that ovulate shape, and that indeed, when you had the tines of the deer, they also had ears. And so that the ovulate shape would have been an ear of one of the deer headdresses. And then there's this other guy, his name's William Romine. I love him to death, and sometimes he makes some really fun leaps. He proposes, now he is I believe his statement on his last book, it's a cognitive understanding of religious outflux of the Hopewell community. He looked at just the oval shape here, and he said, let's take those tongue away. And what he sees on this point over looks a lot like an owl. And then if you take the tongue away and you look from here over, looks a lot like a cougar. Oh, wow. And when we get back to talking about, I'm going to call them more ancient religions, or religions that, and you can look at them around the world, we talk about the world tree, the world axis. Our brains are very binary. Black, white, on, off, good, evil, up, down, left, right. And our brains have always been wired that way, humans. And so when we look at ancient religions, a lot of times they were concerned with the upper world and the lower world. And believe it or not, this thought pattern, the bird, of course, would represent the upper world, and the panther would represent the underworld. Here's a really fun, interesting fact. The next major launch off of culture, which happens roughly about 800 AD. So remember, we've got this quiet period of a couple hundred years, and then this other one launches off. When you look at their cosmology, and we know lots about that. In fact, there's books and books and books about their religion, because they had descendants that were still around when Spanish people were starting to get through, and they were documenting what they thought instead of just looking and thinking they knew what they thought. But in their cosmology, the underwater panther was the ruler of the underworld. And so they wonder, through some of this thought pattern, if the Hopewell religion, which was spread all over the eastern half of the United States, did not persist all the way through in just a much more complicated form through Spanish contact. Our bear shamans, the ray figure, which is this figurine here at the end, is one of the very few figurines that we actually show with a human and an animal in transition. It's one of the very few. And this is a reproduction, and I don't have the real thing, I promise. In fact, it's ceramic, so don't drop it. But it shows the face of a human and an arm. And then when you rotate it this way, it's the bear and a bear claw on the side of his face. And they believe that this guy was meant to sit in your hand. Believe it or not, that's exactly where he feels like he should sit. And as the thought pattern is that as they look, as you turn it from one location to another, that it's the physical transformation of a person into a bear and vice versa. And this guy was found, not this guy, that guy, was found at Newark Earthworks, which was a massive ceremonial center in Newark, Ohio. We're talking, forget how many miles of earthwork there are there. Their great their great mound could fit 4 of ours from side to side. It's over 1,200 feet across. It's an amazing sight if you ever get a chance to go. But this ray figure was one of those that was something. Because before you had, well, there's antlers, and people probably wore antlers. There's bear teeth, but people were probably just wearing that, versus the actual statement of perhaps people saw themselves as shapeshifters. Other items that we have of bears, we have grizzly bear teeth. Yes, grizzly bear teeth. Here, in Ohio, Tennessee, where grizzly bears don't belong. Meriwether Lewis and Clark both wrote about their first encounter with a grizzly bear. In fact, they thought it was bunk. The Native Americans kept telling them of this big, massive, great bear, and they're like, yeah, whatever. Until they found it, and it took 8 50 caliber musket balls to lay the thing down as they were screaming, running into the river, trying to get away from it. Now, you are a local Ohioan, and you decide you're gonna go get some obsidian. And you're trekking across the 1,650 miles it takes to get wherever you need to go. And you encounter the biggest, scariest bear you have ever imagined. And what do? You kill it. There were bear canine teeth and claws that were brought back this way, and a lot of them were drilled to the point that we knew that they were being worn as a necklace, as some other form of wear. And the ray figure here, they do not believe that it was a grizzly bear. On the back side of it, there's a slight hump, and brown bears are the bears that exhibit that slight hump on their back. So a lot of times we're seeing local animals, but then these weird random animals that don't really belong here. But if you think about it, you know, hi everybody, my power animal's a squirrel. And yours is a wolf, and yours is a snake, and yours is a this. And then someone comes forward and is like, you know what? Mine's a bighorn sheep. What's a bighorn sheep? Well, let me tell you, that person can get a lot of extra kudos, if you will, extra oomph, when they had these exotic animals that were being represented in a culture that we had very little context with. So grizzly bears were a thing. And when I said bighorn sheep, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. At the very end, when I first saw that, I thought it was a pig. It's not, it's a bear. It's a hammered copper bear that they felt was worn somehow on a headdress. That was located in Hopewell National Historic Cultural Park. And that's also in Chillicothe. This is one of my favorites. And I'm going to tell you something that happens in history, and I think we can all relate to this. I love talking to historical societies. Do you see my cat shaman? This beautiful pipe that supposedly had inlaid freshwater pearls on it. It was made out of steatite that showed a human in transition with a feline. And in 1848, the first guys that were coming through and documenting mounds, Squire and Davis, wrote about this because they had done some excavations. And at present, we have no idea where that is. Yeah, so what you're looking at over here is actually a reproduction of what we think and how it was described by Squire and Davis in 1848. But one of the things we know, and cats were a thing. They were being displayed, but in very smaller form. The big power animals seem to be deer and bear and wolf. Cats filter in there every so often. And this particular pipe was one of those that was the only other physical material that we have showing a human in transition with an animal. I want you guys to look at that beautiful black thing down there at the end. That came from Posey County, Indiana. Remember I told you about the man site? Now, what makes the man site such an interesting, unique, challenging, exciting kind of thing is that, remember I said that habitation sites or locations where they actually lived are very, very hard to find. And oftentimes, if we find them, it shows that there weren't very many people living there very long. The man site appears to have been a site that housed thousands. Now think about that. If your cultural, like your normalcy is Anderson, and we have a hard time finding Anderson. And then all of a sudden we're finding like Los Angeles. That's saying something. And it is down in southwestern Indiana, not too far from Evansville. And some of the material culture coming out of that shows that they were Ohio Hopewell people. They had some of the distinctive features of the Ohio Hopewell. But something else that was very interesting, remember when I said ceramic and things, they were made to reflect a person and a group? They had ceramics there that were made out of local materials, so stuff they were digging out right out of Posey County ground, but they were decorated in such a style that indicated that they had Georgian, like our Georgia, potters. So what's going on at the man site? It's still relatively unknown. There's been work going towards it, but we don't even own the site. It's still mostly privately owned. The state of Indiana is working to try to obtain and purchase that land. So additional materials and work can be done on it. But some of the artifacts that are coming out of the man site are stunning and crazy and awesome. There's a little bird bone. And I mean, literally, I'd have to get my glasses out even to show you how small it is. But all around the outside of it is etched cricket legs that I literally need a magnifying glass to see. And there are points that were made out of a chert that had occlusions, so holes with crystals stuck in the middle of them. And they managed to make massive blades all the way around this massive hole. The artistry and workmanship coming out of that location is unparalleled. And when I was talking about people in an artisan class, what we were seeing in the Ohio Hopewell, or really specifically the Ohio Hopewell, but also in other locations, is that the artist class stayed in locations. So they were at a site called Trimper Mound, which is about 45 miles south of Chillicothe. There was also some artisan class in Chillicothe. So these raw materials were being shipped to them, and they as a class were working them, and then those materials were then being spread back out around. And so we think that man site is our own very, very, very awesome site that's producing a whole bunch of this beautiful stuff.
Kelly, is that
Wolf shamans, we don't have as many, we don't have any representations of people in transition, but we do know that wolves were important. Why do we know that wolves were important? Because the Adena people had several burials of young people that when they died, their skeletons, and specifically their skulls, showed that their incisors had been pulled during life. And upon burial, they were buried with, when you think about your palate, wolves have the same palate, it's the same hard bone. And there were wolf palates with incisors fitted like dentures into those locations.
just the young?
The few burials that we found, they were young.
Oh, okay.
But once again, you know, a handful of people out of who knows. And so we know wolf and that idea of shape-shifting and into that was an important component. We just don't think that we've had the opportunity to find any materials from that point forward that indicate that that was still as popular as deer and cat shamans and then bears as well. Now, there is a large group of what we're going to call avians, birds, and they did focus mostly on what we're going to call raptors and carrion birds. The reason for this is, and this is something that archaeologically we do know, is that part of their mortuary process for those very special people that were going to be taken and placed into mounds, oftentimes were defleshed before they got there. Now, the process of defleshing is unknown, to be quite honest. Could be that they, very much like the Egyptians, and honestly the Jews even did. They put you in a place for a year and a day, and then they come back and collect your bones. But there's also evidence from historic tribal units that would do sky burials, where they would lay them out and allow animals to predate them, which basically means to eat them, and then they'd come and collect the bones. And so we see lots of raptors, we see lots of ravens and vultures, lots of vultures in this particular time frame. Later on, they become more pileated woodpeckers, which don't eat flesh. We have to think that avians were part of that thought pattern, that they were able to do certain things that people would never be able to do, at least in their lifetimes. We see these beautiful pieces of art, and I'm going to tell you that some of the plummets, those would be those features on the far left over there, are actually way older than the rest of the material I've been showing you. The bottom two are of Hopewell time period, but the one up top that looks really cool, that is more like 3,000 years old. Other raptor and carrion birds, as I said, we see a lot of vultures. Sometimes they're not static. And that's the one thing when you think about art, a lot of times art can be kind of static, but they show movement, they show motion, they show their natural habit, the ways they worked. This guy down on the far left over here, I don't know how many times that there's been a Cooper's hawk outside my window that's eating a bird, and I'm tapping on the glass, and he goes, "What?" That's the what bird. That's what I call them. And then we've got the odd birds. I would call them ducks, but they're not all ducks, so I just call them birds. We've got the prairie hen down here on the bottom. We have a wood duck, that's what we're assuming over here. But interestingly enough, the wood duck, if you look on his rear end, there's actually a hawk or some sort of raptor bird. We're not really sure what that duality is, but it might very likely be back to that whole up, down, left, right thought pattern. The one on the far left, anyone want to venture what the kind of bird that is? It does. And I will tell you that, as I said, there's a lot of alternative, and I've got a picture, just you wait. A lot of alternative theorists that say that Hopewell art was born out of Meso and Central American art. The shape of the base would be the arc of the world. And it also, when you think about it and you put it in your hand, it fits better. But the one on the end is our state bird. It's a cardinal. Yeah, and if you can see him in better pictures, you can see that it's one of those where he's got his head kind of slightly tilted. All right, so here's our other odd birds. These birds don't really belong for the most part. What's this guy look like? Toucan, doesn't he? And the one on the far right or left is looking at you. It looks like a spoonbill or a pelican. The one in the middle, there's a lot of different thought patterns to it. They weren't sure if it was a pileated woodpecker. They weren't sure if it was a raven. There's a lot of people that have put a lot of different forms on it. But pileated woodpecker, I like the best because in later cultures, the pileated woodpecker comes forward and becomes a very big symbol amongst the people. So was there a trade route? I don't know. But one of the things that we're lacking, and this is where the archaeologists said, is if you're moving around raw resources, like obsidian, for example, there's a green obsidian that was massive purchase in the Aztec environment. It's one particular volcano that creates this beautiful green obsidian. And it was traded all throughout the Aztec world. And it was used much prior to the Aztecs. So why don't we have green obsidian up here? Conversely, we had materials up here that became very valued later in time once it made it to Central America, but we don't see any contemporary with the time frame that, in theory, if these folks were getting together and talking, that there should have been some cross flow of material. Okay, other zoomorphic shapes. Look at that beaver. He's even got beaver teeth as teeth. People had domesticated dogs here in North America. So we believe that's a domesticated dog and not necessarily a coyote or a wolf. This guy down here is a wolf. Have you ever seen a dog flip over? Yeah. And so, and then you've got this like big bobblehead bear thing going on here. And so there was some variation and there was some levity in some of the materials that we were seeing coming out. It wasn't all, direct ceremonialism. Remember I was talking about the bighorn sheep? One example of what appears to be a bighorn sheep horn hammered out of copper was found in Ohio. And if you think about it, all of a sudden, bighorn sheep sounds like a really cool power animal. But we have turtles, frogs, squirrels. I put down the Posey County panther down there just for one more touch base because he's awesome. The other thing that was going on during this time frame was geometric designs. The geometric designs were oftentimes stylized animals. So I'm just going to throw a couple things out here. Salamanders, And this, that duality we were talking about, you see a lot of duality in a lot of the geometric figures. The one on the far left, you see the vultures? And William Romine he's an amazing archaeologist, but he also goes into some places that a lot of archaeologists aren't comfortable going. Catch my drift? He goes some fun places. And you know, sometimes time bears him out and sometimes time doesn't. But one of the interesting things about these cross pieces right here is that if you stand in certain locations in the mound complex of a lot of our mounds and you aim them right, then each one of those crosses points to the sunrise and sunset of the solstice and winter and summer solstices. And he's very math-based, so I have a hard time following him. But I have books if anybody's like a real math whiz and wants to read about it. Monsters. One of the things that distinguishes the Hopewell grouping from the later cultures that come after is the later cultures that come after have things like winged flying dragons or serpents, underwater panthers, flaming hawk monsters. They mix and mingle geometric and geomorphic pieces. They mix things up and they make really cool critters out of them. The Hopewell people really did not do that. They stayed pretty true to the true animal, with a few rare exceptions. And this guy's one of them. He looks like a bull, doesn't he? What I see is a horned serpent, which would be a front runner of the feathered serpents that we see, and once again, in the Mississippian culture. If you look at his face, take away the horns, you see the snake head, and then the snake body, and then the rattle. So this is one of those, what we're gonna call aberrations or outliers. We're not really sure what was going on with this, but square in the Hopewell time frame, but somebody was meshing shapes and stuff. And as a general rule, the rest of the culture says, we don't do that. And so there's discussion back and forth of, was it something that somebody just was fiddling around with, or was that some of the early seeds of what we see coming later? Geometric forms on ceramics, duck pot, see the ducks? And geometric forms on ceramics, they just kind of bear through some of the same things we're seeing in a lot of their art. This is also, the one on the right is vultures. And then what about fiber? They had it. The problem is we don't find it often. It takes an incredibly unique environment to preserve fiber. This piece of fiber was roughly dated to about 2,100 years ago. Was found in a cave in Tennessee. I have been lucky enough to be in and around that cave, and I have also been lucky enough to see this piece. And it is amazing. And it still shows part of its pigmentation and design work in it, which very much bears through the geometric forms that we see, you know, those tablets that look like off those tablets. How was it woven? There's a lot of back and forth thinking about how did they make different things. The fibers were willow and dogbane. So you take a willow tree, strip out that inner bark, it can be spun pretty easy. Dogbane is something that softens up a little bit better. They believe that they were spinning by rolling. However, there are a few archaeologists that swear up one side and down the other that they have found whorls. So anybody that does spinning, it's the weight that you would spin and it would spin with it. These are the books I got all those pictures from because the state makes me show you. I own every single one of those books. If anybody would like time to sit and look through them, you are more than welcome to come to the Nature Center and I will be happy to show them to you. Just for funs and giggles, the one that's number 5, Hero Hawk and Open Hand, was part of my graduate work. Like for anything else, but Hero Hawk and Open Hand. And as I said, most of the books that you're going to find on early Native American art span thousands of years. And so a very little bit of this book is dedicated to the Hopewell. A tremendous amount more is dedicated to the Mississippian time frame.